I have over 4,000 hours of playtime in Total War games on Steam alone, and that does not include the countless hours of Rome and Medieval 2 I played on the original discs back in the day, which very likely raises that number by another 1,000 to 2,000 hours. Think about those numbers for a second. Those are hours in another lifetime I could have spent playing Fortnite and Roblox instead, being the proverbial epic pro gamer, dunking my hand in a bag of cheese balls and Doritos, and watching Skibidi toilet videos if I were born 15 years later. But here we are. Now, I play a lot of video games. In fact, it is arguably my biggest passion. But I notice that as I get older and have more and more titles under my belt, that more and more games continue to be left by the wayside. It's only natural, of course. In this age of Steam and ultra compatibility and availability, more games are available to us than at any other given time in history. As a kid, I had a single or eventually low double-digit number of games available to me at any time, which in the past decade and a half have evolved to literally hundreds of games. Some showed their age pretty quickly, some did not as gracefully make the transition between consoles or technologies like from 2D to 3D, but one series which has stayed with me because of its ability to adapt and evolve is indeed Total War. Now, I know that this series has undergone a lot of controversy in the past year especially, and arguably it's made a ton of changes I disagreed with over the past decade, as frankly I've spelled out for you guys a number of times by now. But that doesn't mean it's all bad. In fact, I think it's far from it, and I've done my best to maintain nuance and clarity on what I like and dislike. Now, we can't discuss the intricacies of the best mechanics, lost mechanics, and why Empire's technology tree is better than Warhammer 3's, or why I prefer no technology tree at all. And if you followed me, you'll surely know that I think the older games are by and large vastly superior to the later ones. But if we strip away the issue of pricing, a new game that didn't feel fresh enough, antiquated ways of communicating, or indeed changes that make it hard for me to wholeheartedly love some of the newer titles, Creative Assembly does have a magic ace up its sleeve that very few companies possess so consistently. The ability to more or less never be outclassed in terms of production value and adaptability. And I think you know exactly what I mean. Love it or hate it, or just feel so-so about it, it's not really possible to argue that Total War Warhammer 3 is not the pinnacle of strategy gaming in terms of visual fidelity and scale in a 3D space. I mean, for what's here, with detailed character models and cities on such a large and varied campaign map, and then flipping over to a battlefield which is even more varied and diverse, and let's face it, with effects, structures, and army sizes that few if no other game out there can handle in the same way. I mean, it might not be my preferred cup of tea, but there's no denying it's hugely impressive. But I'm not here to talk about Warhammer 3. Warhammer 3 is after all part of the latest batch of Total War games, so you'd kind of assume it feels modern, right? But what if we went 8 years back in time? Or 10? Or 12? 13? Or what about, dare I say it, 14? If it's not obvious to you yet, this series has looked, and frankly continues to look, unbelievably good, and consistently so for a very long time now, if not throughout its lifetime. Whether we are talking about Antiquity's Constantinople, Rome 2's sunny depiction of Egypt, Shogun 2's vibrant battlefields, Napoleon's polished symphony of depth of field and anti-aliasing, or Empire's revolutionary naval battles, there's just no escaping the dominance, the hegemony, the absolute power of Creative Assembly's game engines in terms of production value. I'm absolutely serious, like nowhere else can you get this type of action, game after game, in your favorite historical time periods on this scale and visual depth. I do give this series a lot of flack for not catering to my every need as it should, and as every game should honestly. But there is no denying that in terms of production value, of a modern look and feel, and a AAA experience in terms of visuals and sound, there just isn't another strategy series like Total War. And to be real with you, this is actually kind of scary because sometimes the extreme production value that admittedly does vary slightly from game to game, well, it does something to my mind and specifically my perception of time. I don't think it's unreasonable to argue that both Rome Total War and Medieval 2 do look and feel like games from their era. Don't get me wrong, they were and remain extremely good looking for their time and do remain charming to look at and play. Lord knows I play more Rome and Medieval 2 today than I do the later titles. But something changed with Empire. It felt like, despite a few mechanics and fine-tuned aspects sadly left behind, that Empire was the first truly modern Total War game that could stand the test of time on its own. Now, I don't mean that necessarily in a mechanic sense. God, I'm giving you guys so many caveats in this video to make sure you don't misunderstand me here, but I'm looking at it from a gameplay visual perspective. Empire was the first Total War game with native WSD controls, which means that today it feels just as simple to pick up and play as Rome 2 or even Warhammer 3. It was the first game where you could order a unit to move somewhere on the map and then click somewhere else and go about your business without having the army fast forward to its location. And while I do disagree with some of these upcoming changes, it was the first game to introduce the ever-present diplomacy system and a technology tree, both of which have remained in the series ever since, is all I'm saying. All of this means that Empire, a 14-year-old game, appears extremely familiar, and importantly, modern and fresh all these years later. On top of that, you have the entire look of this game, which even now, again, 14 years later, this is 2009 we're talking about, still looks unbelievably good, especially with a few simple mods as seen here. All of this goes for every other Total War game I mentioned here as well, but Empire does perhaps stand out the most due to its age. It's such a markedly and massive step up from Medieval 2 in terms of production value, and that's quite astonishing to realize when these games came out only 3 years apart. I mean, think about that. 3 years to go from some charming but cartoony looking ass game to the most realistic depiction of war you'd ever seen at the time in a matter of 3 champagne popping New Year celebrations. Compare and contrast that level of difference to now, where 3 Kingdoms from 2019 arguably looks the same as Warhammer 3 from 2022, albeit with different character models and approach to style. Or worse, as in the case of Total War Troy from 2020, because that game looks essentially identical to Pharaoh from 2023. The fact that I can go and play Napoleon, a game from 2010, and feel like I've never seen a better looking strategy game is just unreal. I mean, look at this stuff. Creative Assembly knew what they were doing, and they kept on doing it time after time and game after game, at least to the extent where it felt and feels like they got the competition dead to rights. This gets me back to that time-bending thing I mentioned earlier. I'm clearly not the only person loving these games, and some so much that they've dedicated their free time to actively making the games better. Mods are an essential part of why so many Total War games continue to feel fresh years later, and frankly they're so monumental and so important to me that I rarely play Total War games without some form of modding anymore. Perhaps Napoleon being the standout, since it's just so good. Now I of course am aware that the Total War games I play are older titles for the most part, but I still happened upon a revelation the other month when I was harassing Creative Assembly earlier this year about updating Napoleon Total War's engine to play nicely with modern CPUs. Yes, I am indeed the champion of the people. Of course, I didn't want it to stop there. I wanted CA to come back and patch Attila. I want them to come back and patch Empire, and pretty much everything else you can possibly imagine essentially. But then someone reminded me, Creative Assembly largely only looks out for the latest 2 or perhaps 3 latest titles at a time. Their return to Rome 2 updating in 2017 was a one-off after all. Total War Attila is 8 years old. Empire is 14 years old. I might play them on a daily, weekly or monthly basis, but that's not necessarily normal. In fact, although I stand proudly beside a few thousand other brave historical loving comrades, I mostly play older Total War games these days. But when thinking about it, it felt so weird to me. Old? Can a game that looks like this really be old? I suppose they're right. But another factor that toyed with my head was indeed the modding scene. Thanks to the efforts of developers to make their games customizable to its players, and indeed the enormous amount of time and effort to dig into these engines and to make them even more open and moldable, older titles keep getting transformed, improved and expanded to, in some cases, almost 20-year-old games if you count Rome Remastered as essentially Rome. In my head, this keeps them fresh, it keeps them interesting, and most importantly, it keeps them feeling new. Virtually every Total War game since at least Rome and Medieval 2 have new mods or new versions of older mods releasing every year or more. And if we combine this fact, namely that modders keep on improving these games year after year, with the fact that I don't just keep playing them, but keep doing deep dives into these mods, and talk to other people who love and play them too, I don't know how to explain it other than that, honestly, they feel more new to me than even most of the latest Total War games themselves. Another main factor is of course the innate nature of these games themselves. If you truly want to experience a depiction of the 18th century as authentic as possible in video games, Empire Total War is honestly not far from it. Might in fact be the quintessential 18th century game out there even 14 years later, and is arguably the only one in the genre to truly offer a grand, visually beautiful, and mostly modern feeling gameplay design. Although of course games like EU4 is kinda competing in a different league here. It doesn't hurt that this same idea goes for virtually every Total War game depicting their specific eras. And even then I haven't even touched upon Total War's signature battles, which still blows everything else out of the water. And I mean, with or without mods, it's still hard to find anything out there, even from Total War itself, that looks and feels as good as the battles of a game like Napoleon. I guess in the end, my point is that Total War games from the early and mid 2000s, particularly when coupled with mods, have a charm and a staying power that has managed to transcend time, an ability extremely few other game series have as consistently. I'll be the first to admit that I'd love more innovation in mechanics and depth in new games, but this is not mutually exclusive with the fact that the production value, the audiovisual appeal, and the concept of Total War itself is a winning formula that has created a franchise unlike any other. So successful in fact that it's completely and utterly dominating its very own genre, to the point where virtually nobody else dare enter it. I just wish Creative Assembly would return to these games, because if nothing else, the entire point of this video is my way of saying that, yes, games like Empire and Napoleon do feel fantastic all these years later, and with a bit of patching, I'd love nothing more than for CA to expand on them even now. Or you know, make an Empire Remastered or an Empire 2. Just a helpful suggestion on my part. But what do you think? Are Total War games particularly long-lasting? And if so, why? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!